So the Supreme Court weighs in and the Dems freak out. Donald Trump will be a king. He'll be a dictator. Free to murder at will. Can you say distraction? Can you say distortion? We look at the actual ruling as it reads when it comes to immunity. Jonathan Turley, you were doing instant analysis yesterday and reflective analysis today. Your book couldn't be written at a better time than with The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in the Age of Rage. I saw misplaced rage last night. Did you?
I did, and it's actually what the book talks about, that we've gone through these periods before, and the book explores how often during these periods of anger and division, free speech is the first victim, but so is the Constitution. And what you saw last night was the addiction of rage, that people won't admit it, but they like it. And so the outpouring of it, how rage quickly overtook reason, is always sort of unsettling to watch. The argument that this is, we're going to have death squads and people are just going to be whacked left and right. And what really sort of brought it home was the president's address from the White House. What the president said last night was not true. And he was misleading the public about that opinion. It was not just unfair to the Supreme Court. It was unfair to the public that they were told something that simply is not true.
Here he is, cut one.
Now, over 200 years later, today's Supreme Court decision, once again, it will depend on the character of the men and women who hold that presidency that are going to define the limits of the power of the presidency, because the law will no longer do it. I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years. But any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law.
Is that true?
No, it is categorically untrue. First of all, the Supreme Court adopted the middle option here. They rejected the more extreme arguments made by the Trump team and by the lower courts. And basically, the court adopted a sort of three-tiered system. They said there are certain core constitutional functions where a president has absolute immunity. There are other official functions where he has a presumptive immunity, which means that prosecutors can overcome it if they can show that this was really done not for official purposes. And then finally, you have unofficial acts, which are a great number of acts of a president, and those have no protection at all. And so there was this idea that there was absolute immunity across the board for anything the president does is entirely untrue. What was also glaring for most of us is President Biden citing himself as a paragon of constitutional fealty. This president has racked up an impressive array of losses in federal court that have repeatedly found that he has violated the Constitution, including racial discrimination rulings, but also you have a president who, as I discuss in my new book, is the most anti-free speech president since John Adams. I mean, he has created an unprecedented system of censorship through financial support and his public statements. So the idea that he is really the symbol of constitutional fealty is really alarming. It's so detached from reality.
Yeah, the student loans is probably the another example that stands out, too, where he said, I defied the Supreme Court. They said no, and I didn't quit. I found a way to do it. Well, don't you think some of this distortion? The president went to law school, allegedly. Thought he was at the top of his class. Turns out he was at the bottom of his class. Who knew? And at Syracuse. But do you think he knows he was distorting the truth? Or do you think he was just feeding off of Justice Sotomayor, who wrote the dissenting opinion? She said, the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the country and possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way under the majority's reasoning, he will now be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for pardon, immune, immune, immune. Is that accurate?
No. And I was really surprised by the hyperbolic rhetoric in the dissent. I thought it undermined the dissent. Look, I'm not a huge fan of presidential power. I'm a Madisonian scholar. I tend to favor Congress and fights with the president. But I felt there were good faith arguments on both sides. And even the opposing side, the government acknowledged that there was immunity for many of these issues. They just didn't want sweeping absolute immunity. And as Chief Justice Roberts lays out, there's always been a recognition of immunity for presidents. They're just simply, in this opinion, clarifying where that line is. What was really amazing last night, looking at Joe Biden, is he was vice president when President Obama killed a U.S. citizen in a drone strike.
Alawaki.
Yes, and he was vice president. And then the Obama administration fought the family's efforts to try to litigate the issue. So should Obama and Biden have been charged with murder in that case? Should they be charged with crimes associated with, I represented Congress when Obama ordered funding that had not been given to his administration for Obamacare. And we won on that issue, that he had essentially spent millions and millions of dollars that for a purpose not approved by Congress. Was that a crime he could be charged with? That's what the majority was trying to get at. They were trying to find a way to give presidents breathing room. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, when Roberts says, look, a president needs to have communications with their aides, previous Democratic administrations, including the Obama administration, argued that point. So all this hyperventilation by pundits is amazing, since they were completely silent when Obama vaporized a citizen or argued some of these very same points.
I don't want to get you angrier, Jonathan, but I do want to play a little bit more for our audience. Here's more. Rachel Maddow, Joy Reid, Van Jones, Nicole Wallace. Cut 4.
This is a death squad ruling. This is a ruling that says that as long as you can construe it as an official or quasi-official act, you can do absolutely anything. Absolutely anything, and never be held accountable, not only while you are president, but forever.
They've declared the president and former presidents to be kings, but they've also declared themselves the hand of the king.
It's almost like a license to thug in a way. Like, you can do whatever you want, and the Supreme Court is probably going to let you get away with it.
So that's Van Jones. It's a license to thug.
Yeah. Well, the amazing thing is that, we have the most successful Constitution, the longest serving Constitution in the world. That's still here for a reason. We have survived periods that would reduce most countries into a fine pumice. And the reason is that we have a system designed to survive. And, what these people ignore is that there are checks and balances on a president. He can be impeached. He can be removed. There are federal courts that can enjoin him. There are all of these protections. Just because the president can't be criminally charged doesn't mean that the president can't be stopped. And so all of this effort to suggest that the president now is just basically a government unto himself ignores the entirety of the Constitution. But it also reflects this crisis of faith that we have today. And it's being fueled by members of Congress and political leaders who are saying, we now have a tyranny. We now have a dictatorship. We're going to have death squads. You had Whoopi Goldberg saying that gays and reporters will just be disappeared. You have many people saying this will be our last election. All of that overheated rhetoric obviously is quite popular, but it's also dangerous because there's some people that believe it. They actually believe that that's true.
I know.
And if they do, they believe that anything they do then is justified.
So what you do is got to keep Joe Biden in office because Donald Trump will be a king. And they, it's got to be to a degree of pushback, but also understand that people are being hyperbolic. So let me give you an example. If, for example, Richard Nixon wanted immunity for Watergate, right? Didn't he say I have presidential immunity? Under this, would President Nixon have gotten immunity for Watergate?
Watergate was a break-in of your political opponent's headquarters.
Right.
He would have to somehow argue that that was an official function, and the courts would reject it. The closer question comes when you have something like the Pentagon Papers, right, where you have the president ordering something to get the Pentagon Papers back from Ellsworth, Ellsberg, then it gets a little tougher because he's claiming that he was trying to protect national security. But even in those gray areas, it doesn't mean that the president can do it. right? He can be enjoined, he can be impeached, he can be removed, as President Nixon was. So when people say, you know, John Dean saying President Nixon could have gotten away with it, why? I mean, let's assume for a second that a court says that breaking into the opposing party's office in the Watergate is an official function for the purpose of immunity. It doesn't mean that he has immunity from impeachment.
Right. So real quick on Chutkan, on the next phase with President Trump. So the judge suggested in the defense and prosecution, when she regained control of the case, she intended to give Trump an extra day of preparation for each day he lost in the stay of the proceedings. So if she sticks to that decision, she'll owe Trump 82 days of preparations, and before any trial could begin, equivalent to maybe December 13th when the case was first frozen. And the original schedule would be March 4th. But there's no trial date set at the moment. Would likely start counting those 2.5 months only after she conducted a fact-finding hearing. The fact-finding hearing would force Jack Smith to say everything he's got in order to persuade that this was outside the president's discretion and his job description, right?
Right. You know, Smith has the advantage of having a very favorable judge who is also very motivated. She tried to support Smith in getting a trial before the election, and many of us were surprised because the D.C. District Court is not called the Rocket Docket. That's the Virginia court across the river. The D.C. courts operate on a much more deliberative and slow pace. She took out all the stops, and by the way, that ultimately hurt her because she was moving so fast to try to get a trial before the election. She didn't create any record. So now she has to create a record. That's going to take time. I'm very doubtful. She has to deal with the Fisher decision, which knocked out potentially the obstruction count. Those two decisions sort of ripped the wings off Smith's case. So he's got to put it back together, either in a superseding indictment or he's going to have to come up with a very creative way to go forward on part of these charges. So
the president is asking for his New York case conviction to be dismissed under this new immunity ruling. Does he have standing?
Oh, he does have standing. The question is, will it be successful? What I think Mershon is likely to say, because Mershon's ruled against him fairly consistently, is that Mershon's likely to say, well, he's going to do a type of harmless error type of analysis and say, yeah, maybe Hope Hicks falls into this area, but she was not the really key witness. And I think that even if you take Hope Hicks's testimony out, there was ample evidence for the jury to reach this conclusion. But it's going to create a new appellate decision. So the odds are still against his setting aside the conviction, but it adds another appellate issue and by the way, that's quite a pile on because I think that Mershon's already committed reversible error.
All right. We got to pick up Jonathan Turley's book because he's not available as much as he wants to be to everybody individually. So this is a great way to get his philosophy, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. Jonathan, great to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.